All right, hello everybody. Welcome back to what is sort of the capstone in our multi-year series through an NEH grant entitled Energizing Humanities in California's San Joaquin Valley. And before we get going with tonight's speaker, Mark Arax, we're gonna just take a look at a few pictures in tribute to actually the first speaker we had in this series, Gerald Haslam, who came down to campus about 3 years ago and gave a really inspiring talk and just really set this grant in motion and sort of set the stage for a super inspiring series that spanned 3 and then kind of into 4 years as we all transitioned online. So yeah, there's Jack Hernandez, the old Levin Center director, introducing Gerald. And I just have fond memories, not only of that night, but of his writing. I come from a long line of folks that lived in Bakersfield and Oildale, but then there was about a generation gap of folks that didn't live there. So when I came to Bakersfield College, it was based on my 9-year-old memories. And he was the first writer I read in my adult life that kind of painted a much broader picture of the San Joaquin Valley. And he has that gift, right? I think a lot of writers have sort of the time they put in, but also just this inherent feeling for telling really deep stories like Mark Arax tonight too, that just puts you in a place, they hit you in the gut, and they make you look at your surroundings in a completely different way. So this is it's kind of a moment to think about Gerald Haslam's legacy. And after I introduce Mark too, he's going to talk a little bit about his connection to him and his experience. But this is a really neat through line from our first speaker in this whole entire series to the final one tonight. So yeah, this is really fun and emotional looking at these pictures and just thinking about this great person and author and thinker. Okay, so now I'm going to pivot and introduce our speaker for tonight. Mark Arax is an author and journalist whose writings on California and the West have received numerous awards for literary nonfiction. A former staffer at the LA Times, his work has appeared in the New York Times and California Sunday Magazine. His books include a memoir of his father's murder, a collection of essays about the West, and the best-selling The King of California, which won a California Book Award, and the William Saroyan Prize from Stanford University. It was also named a top book by the LA Times and the San Francisco Chronicle. Mark's newest book, The Dreamt Land, Chasing Water and Dust Across California, is being hailed by critics as one of the most important books ever written about the West. I'm going to quote critic David Eulens, who states that, quote, "The Dreamt Land is the book Mark Arax was born to write. Nuanced, deeply researched, and profoundly personal, it offers, through its history of agriculture in California, a deep dive into the soul of the state. Arax knows the territory. He's written about rural California for many years. This is his crowning achievement, a work of reportage that's also a work of literature. It belongs on the short list of great books about the state." Top graduate of Fresno State and Columbia University, Mark left the LA Times in 2007 after a public fight over censorship of his story on the Armenian genocide. Taught literary nonfiction at Claremont McKenna and Fresno State. Mr. Arax is the father of 3 children who lives on a suburban farm in Fresno. So please welcome our speaker for tonight, Mr. Mark Arax.
Hey, Josh, thank you so much. When this was all set up, we thought maybe even Jerry might be in the virtual audience there. So it's sad to see Jerry go. He was a pal of mine. Sometimes I would do a piece and I'd be working on it and thinking, wow, this is all my piece. And then I'd do a little more research and find that Jerry was there 20 years earlier and already put his mark on it, so it made it even more of a challenge to make it mine. He was an inspiration, not just for the writing he did, but the way he lived. He lived with cancer from 1996 to just a week ago. So there's a lesson in that too. I'd like to start this off with a little reading in Jerry's memory from the Dreamt Land. The challenge for writers, Jerry, myself, others before us, after us, is if we're writing about this place, which is a wonderful canvas, we're not just writing for the locals, we're writing for people from afar. And we have to describe this singular landscape to them. And each time we do that, we have to do it kind of differently than the time before. I mean, you can steal from yourself, I guess. You can plagiarize from yourself, I guess, and it's not a crime, but it is kind of a crime as a writer to do that. You have to come up with a new way. And so in this book, I took a little bit of some old descriptions, but most of this is a new attempt to describe to the reader what it's like to drive up Highway 99. Okay. This is the prologue. On a summer day in the San Joaquin Valley, 101 in the shade, I merge onto Highway 99 past downtown Fresno and steer through the vibrations of heat. I'm headed to the valley's deep south, to a little farm worker town in a far corner of Kern County called Lost Hills. This is where the biggest farmer in America, the one whose mad plantings of almonds and pistachios have triggered California's nut rush, keeps on growing, no matter drought or flood. He doesn't live in Lost Hills, he lives in Beverly Hills. How has he managed to outwit nature for so long? The GPS tells me to take Interstate 5, the fastest route through the belly of the state, but I'm partial to Highway 99, the old road that brought the Okies and Mexicans to the fields and deposited a twang on my Armenian tongue. 99 runs 2 lanes here, 3 lanes there, through miles of agriculture broken every 20 minutes by fast food, gas station, and cheap motel. Tracks of houses, California's last affordable dream, civilized 3 or 4 exits, and then it's back to the open road, splattered with the guts and feathers of chickens that jumped ship on the slaughterhouse drive. Pink and white oleanders divide the highway, and every third vehicle that whooshes by is a big rig. More often than not, it is hauling away some piece of the valley's unbroken bounty. The harvest begins in January with one type of mandarin and ends in December with another type of mandarin, and in between comes everything in your supermarket produce and dairy aisle, except for bananas and mangoes, though the farmers here are working on the tropical too. I stick to the left lane and stay ahead of the pack. The big rig drivers are cranky 2 ways, and the farm workers in their last leg vans are half asleep. 99 is the deadliest highway in America. Deadly in the rush of harvest, deadly in the quiet of fog, deadly in the blur of Saturday nights when the field work is done and the beer drinking becomes a second humiliation. 20 miles outside Fresno, I cross the Kings, the river that irrigates more farmland than any other river here. The Kings is bone dry, as usual. To find its flow, I'd have to go looking in 1,000 irrigation ditches in the fields beyond. There's a mountain range to my left and a mountain range to my right, and in between a plain flatter than Kansas where crop and sky meet. One of the most dramatic alterations of the Earth's surface in human history took place here. The hillocks that existed back in Yokut Indian days were flattened by a hunk of metal called the Fresno scraper. Every river busting out of the Sierra was bent sideways, if not backward, by a bulwark of ditches, levees, canals, and dams. The farmer corralled the snowmelt and erased the valley, its desert and marsh. He leveled its hog wallows, denuded its salt brush, and killed the last of its mustang, antelope, and tule elk. He emptied the sky of tens of millions of geese and drained the 800 square miles of Tulare Lake dry. The farmer did this first in the name of wheat, then beef, milk, raisins, cotton, and nuts. Once he finished grabbing the flow of the 5 rivers that ran across the plain, he used his turbine pumps to seize the water beneath the ground. As he bled the aquifer dry, he called on the government to bring him an even mightier river from afar. Down the great aqueduct, by freight of politics and gravity, came the excess waters of the Sacramento River. The farmer commanded the distant flow. The more water he took, the more crops he planted, and the more crops he planted, the more water he needed to plant more crops, and on and on. 1 million acres of the valley floor, greater than the size of Rhode Island, are now covered in almond trees. I pity the outsider trying to make sense of it. My grandfather, a survivor of the Armenian genocide, traveled 7,000 miles by ship and train in 1920 to find out if his uncle's exhortation, "The grapes here are the size of jade eggs," was true. My father, born in a vineyard outside Fresno, was a raisin grower before he became a bar owner. I grew up in the suburbs where our playgrounds were named after the pioneers of fruit, and irrigation canals shot through our neighborhoods to farms we did not know. For half my life, I never stopped to wonder how much was magic, how much was plunder. That's for Jerry. So that is how I tee off this book, because I want to talk to the reader about something that we share, and that is usually a kid growing up in his place or her place doesn't know their place. They grow up dumb to it. And at some point, if they live there long enough, their eyes grow so accustomed to it that their eyes almost become callous to it, and they don't see it then either. So I think I didn't have the luxury of that at a certain point after my father was murdered. I took a tape recorder and I went out and I started interviewing family members, trying to figure out our past, how we got here, what is this place we came to. And over the years, I've collected thousands of hours of oral history, starting with the family and then moving outward to others. I think we had a panel discussion before this, and we were a bunch of folks who were writing about this place, talking about the idea that if you do live your life right, you start off maybe stupid to your town and your valley, but as you get older, maybe you leave this earth a little less stupid, And that's kind of my goal. And it's the question that ends up taking me farther and farther out. I started my first book with my family, and then the second book with the Valley, and then the third book with all of California, and then this fourth book with all of California and then some. This book begins in drought. Because this is Earth Day, Earth Week, Earth Month, we're going to talk about how this landscape was changed, California. I have to get out and see things before it occurs to me that maybe there's a book there. In 1997, it wasn't drought, it was flood. We had a flood, and I got a call from a colleague of mine. At the time, I was working at the LA Times, and my colleague was one of in Sacramento, at our bureau in Sacramento. And he said, hey, the flood waters have brought back Tulare Lake. And I didn't really know Tulare Lake. And so I pulled out a map, and on the map, there was a lake near the town of Corcoran, but it was a square lake. And I thought, gee, that's so peculiar. How could a lake be square? So I got in the car and I drove down, I think it was Highway 43, and I passed Hanford, and I came into this flat basin, and the concrete road, the asphalt road, led to a dirt road, and I followed the dirt road, and the dirt road ended at the base of this earthen embankment. I later learned that it was a levee, a dike, something that you might see in Holland or the Mississippi Delta. And I climbed up this levee, and as I made my way up to the top, the air itself changed. And when I looked out, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This was the richest cotton patch in America, and it had been transformed into an inland sea. The wind was whipping white caps past these telephone poles. And if you looked closely at the telephone poles, you could see these stain marks from the previous floods, 1969, 1983, 1969, 1955, I believe, 1938. Each was a flood. That nature had found a way past all the contrivances of farming, past the canals, past the ditches, past the dams, and in heavy years of snowmelt, the three rivers that, well, actually four rivers that emptied into Tulare Lake would break past the contrivances of man and flood that land again. And it was only a bit of the old lake. The old lake was 880 square miles. It was the most dominant feature on the California map. Before the settlers came here and started draining dry that lake by taking the river's waters and putting it onto their farmland. Before that, we had 4 native Californian tribes, each part of the Yokut Nation, living along those shores. They fished that shallow lake. The women would wade in and actually pick up shellfish with their feet, and the men would take out these tule rafts and float on the river, and there would be a hole in the rafts, and they would spear fish there. 15 years later, the Chinese fishermen would come in and haul off terrapin, turtles, from the lake, and that they would take to San Francisco, and the finest restaurants in San Francisco in the 1870s would serve turtle soup from Tulare Lake. This was the history that I didn't know about as I was standing up on that embankment, watching nature find itself again. The speed with which nature found itself was a stunning display. There were shorebirds there, and they were stabbing at fish, and it just happened within a week. As I was driving back that day to Fresno, I thought, wow, the story of this lake is a kind of untold story. And as I dug in, I started figuring out how that lake dried up and how in the 1920s, a group of plantation owners from the South, cotton growers from the South, from Virginia, Georgia, places like that, they had been chased out of the South by the boll weevil, and they were looking for a new place to plant their cotton. And they came west. They found the Tulare Lake Basin. They drained that lake even drier. Eventually they planted dams along those rivers. The Kings, the Kaweah, the Tule, and the Kern. And they basically transplanted the cotton plantation culture onto this corner of the West. And this explained to me why this place I grew up in didn't feel like California, at least not the mythical California, the Hollywood of California, the San Francisco, California. It felt like a piece of the South. And that wasn't just, that was a couple different migrations. It was the southern cotton plantation owners coming here, and then the Dust Bowl bringing hundreds of thousands of white Okies. As I was doing that book, which became The King of California, I was driving down 99 one day, another drive, and I was near a town called Pixley. And I looked to the side of the road and I saw this shack. And the shack looked like something that was lifted out of the 1930s South. It was really run down. And I thought, wow, no one's living there. No one could possibly be living there. But it was a cold day, and I could see out of the stovepipe in the tar paper roof that puffs of smoke were coming out. So somebody was living in there. So I pulled off, I think it was Road 76, went over the railroad tracks, and then went into a vineyard, a dirt road, followed that dirt road up a bit, stopped the car, got out, and I could see that this shack was built on stilts, because this was, after all, the old Tulare Lake bottom. And there was an outhouse in the back and a bunch of junk and a pump beside this and a pecan tree that had been hacked away. And as I later learned, that the pecan tree was the limbs of it were being burned to keep this shack warm. And I knocked on the door a couple times, and the door creaked open, and up above me was a black man whose name was James Dixon. He was 96 at the time, and he talked in a stutter, and he was afraid that I was a county inspector come to shut down this house, because no human should have been living in there. This was, the chickens had better places to roost, hen houses, than this place. It was falling down. In fact, he had lived in a shack just next to it, and it had burned down a decade earlier, I think. I may have been there that day, I can't remember, with a fantastic photographer named Matt Black. I certainly know that Matt and I spent many, many subsequent days there talking to Mr. Dixon, who told us that a whole migration of African Americans who had left the South and Southwest had come to California. And they were an exception, kind of the great exception to the Great Migration. They didn't go from the South and Southwest to the big city. They didn't go to Detroit, Chicago, New York. When they came west, they didn't go to LA or Oakland. They wanted to keep alive their rural roots. And so they went from the rural South and Southwest, followed the cotton trail to California, and was working in the fields of the San Joaquin Valley. Some of them in Tulare Lake, some of them outside. And they came at a time in the 40s and early 50s when the cotton machine was just being invented. And so they were actually picking cotton in the same fields where the machine was being experimented with. And so they were picking the edge of those fields at a very time when the machine was picking the middle, the big fat cotton in the middle. And so this machine would idle their labor. And in time they would find other farm work. They would raise their children in these little settlements that were planted in the alkali, salty soil of the San Joaquin Valley. Racism, even though they had escaped the racism of the South and Southwest and thought they were coming to a new place, a kind of promised land, the racism of California also locked them out of the towns and cities. They couldn't live in Corcoran or Hanford or Visalia or Tulare. So they ended up settling in these alkali flats. That's where I found them 50, 60 years later. Their children had gone, they were there. And I had the privilege of telling their story, of recording their story. Hundreds of hours of oral history. They're all gone now. So The King of California was the story of the South come West. The cotton growers, their patrician sense of entitlement, their cotton pickers, all the way down to the mint juleps that they drank. Through that lake basin came great migrations of Latinos, Mexicans, and White Okies. And so that book told, using the Tulare Lake Basin, it told a whole history that started with the Yokuts and then saw these great migrations come to California and play out in this incredible drama in this lake basin, where growers were trying to stifle unions, where growers were trying to stifle nature, where they're trying to invent a new South, and they largely succeeded. That book, at the end of it, I thought, my goodness, I will never write another book about water. It's way too complicated. It's too difficult to keep the reader interested. You have to explain too many technical details. And you know, I prefer to think of myself as a storyteller. So I put it away, did another book of essays, and then 5-6 years ago, it wasn't flood, but it was drought that then persuaded me to go back in and tell an even bigger story of California water. And that is the Dreamt Land. The King of California took me 5 years, and it was going to take me 10, and I brought on a very good friend of mine, Rick Wartzman, and we joined up together and wrote that book together. The Dreamt Land, that's the only time I've ever written a book with anyone else. It's not an easy thing to do, but Rick and I ended up coming out of that experience even better friends than going in. I don't think co-writers of books usually say that. The Dreamt Land was all mine. Instead of the we voice, I could return to the I voice. And I thought, okay, how do I make this story compelling? And I thought, there are no rules to this story. I'm going to use memoir, my family. I'm not someone who parachuted into California to tell the story of drought. My family's story played out here. So I was going to use our story where it was relevant. I was going to use reportage on the land, meeting farmers and others who were caught in the midst of this historic drought. And then I was going to use history. At some point, this book basically starts in the present day in drought, on the land, as the farmer and citizens are fighting, cities are fighting this drought. At some point, you have to ask yourself a question, and I did, which is, there was something kind of insane going on. In the middle of the drought, in the middle of this historic drought, the footprint of agriculture was actually growing. The farmer was pulling off record crop after record crop. And then the footprint of suburbia was growing. So the sprawl of suburbia, the sprawl of agriculture was taking us to places that I felt were no longer sustainable. And yet, in spite of drought, we were growing. In spite of wildfire, we were moving people into the path of wildfire. Where did this come from? This kind of culture, this ethos to defy nature. Was it a human impulse? Was there something particularly Californian about it? And that's where you go back to history. My editor, fretting that this book was going to be 600-700 pages, it turned out to be 520. He said, could you start the story going backward with the gold rush? And I thought that's a perfectly reasonable place to start it. But really, the first extraction of a resource of California was not gold, but it was the body of the native, the Indian. We took the body of the, I say we, I think of it as a collective sin. It's our original sin. But really, it was the Spanish missionaries coming up through Mexico, which was a land they had conquered, coming to California to conquer a new place. They had taken the body of the Indian, and through the taking of the body of the Indian, they had been able to bend the first rivers, build the first dams and aqueducts and canals, grow the first crops. We had a profound native culture here, okay? Prolific native culture. 250 to 300,000 indigenous in California. It was the biggest concentration of indigenous of anywhere in North America. And they lived in peace largely. You know, we know the history of the natives on the plains, the natives in Florida, the natives, the Sioux, the Seminole, the Cherokee. They often had to go to war over limited resources. In California, there was plenty, and so these folks mostly lived in peace. So we have to account for the original sin of California, which is a genocide. And there's some irony in my family escaping an Armenian genocide, the first genocide of the 20th century, and coming to reinvent themselves in a land where an earlier genocide had taken place. So that history became very relevant to trying to figure out what was going on the land today. In the earlier panel discussion we had, I talked about how I had gone to a junior high school called Tenaya. And I played football and baseball, and we were the Tenaya Braves, and we played against the Wawona School, the Ahwahnee School, the Tioga School, the Sequoia School, the Yosemite School. We had no idea why these schools were named that way. And in this book, I talk about how in 1853, the settlers, under the umbrella of a battalion called the Mariposa Battalion, had gone up into Yosemite Valley. They were the first white men to go into that valley. And their job was to take out this stubborn tribe of people out of their homeland, a homeland that dated back thousands of years. And this tribe, there were just a few members left. They had been decimated by the missions and other things that came before. This tribe was the Ahwahneechee, the Ahwahnee, and their chief was Chief Tenaya. The battalion murdered Chief Tenaya's son. He came out from his hiding place with the rest of the survivors, and as he stood above the body of his son, he issued a curse against the white man. It's an incredible curse that's in this book. And as I'm dealing with the nature, the history and the nature of that land, it occurs to me to wonder why I could go through these schools in Fresno and never learn where the name Tenaya came from, Ahwahnee, Wawona, all of it. We were dumb to that history. So the book then moves from that original sin to a second sin, which is the extraction of gold. And this is a kind of beginning to a land that nowhere else in America happens. I mean, Manifest Destiny had its place in all the other places of settlement as America went west. But here, before Manifest Destiny could do what it was going to do, we had a gold rush. And California started off in this supercharged way. And that culture of extraction, which blasted away mountains, took water and put it in a hose so that water would come out with more force, and you could pound away at mountains and river banks and unearth this gold. That also let loose our first environmental disaster. The mountains melted and came down the rivers. And as they came down the rivers, they clogged our great rivers. And then they flooded out and sanded out the alluvial plain, so that the beginning of farming in California in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s got damaged by the gold mines. And we had a choice in this state what to do. Was our future extracting gold, or was our future mining the soil down in the valley? A huge environmental case went to the Supreme Court, and it was decided that the mines could not pollute the fertile soil of the farmland. And so you see the great industrialists who made the most money off of gold. They are living in San Francisco on Nob Hill, and they decide that they are now going to industrialize agriculture. And they buy up huge chunks of the valley, huge chunks, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of acres, and they plant but one crop, wheat. And at some point in the 1880s and 1890s, California is producing more wheat than any other single place in the world. A man named Isaac Friedlander, a great industrialist living in San Francisco. By great, I mean large. His vision was large. He was a large man himself, 6'7". He weighed over 300 pounds, and they said his stride was twice the stride of a normal man's. And his vision was to link the fields to harvest and then the shipping of this wheat. And he bought a bunch of clipper ships and ended up taking this wheat, which they called California Velvet, taking it to Liverpool, England, and California Velvet was sold across Europe. It's the finest wheat. But there was a problem in that kind of agriculture. It was a monoculture. Some of the wheat was being grown just by rain. Some of it was grown by the early diversions of the rivers. But because it was a monoculture, it was robbing the soil of certain nutrients. And as fast as the wheat culture rose up, as fertile and fecund as it was, it ended up withering and drying. And the industrialists decided that they were going to sell off this land to smaller farmers. And so we see a second, maybe third transformation of early California, from big industrial agriculture to smaller farmers coming in and buying their 20, 40, 60, 160 acre parcels and planting not wheat, but a diversity of crops. Vineyards, orchards, vegetable fields. We see the footprint of agriculture then move from the alluvial plain, where it made sense, where they were taking rivers' flows to water these diversified crops. And we see the footprint go beyond the alluvial plain to soil that isn't so good. And then in 1920, the year my grandfather arrives, okay, drawn by that myth of California, not just the grapes were the size of jade eggs, but the watermelons were so big. This is what his uncle was writing him. The watermelons were so big that when you scooped out the meat, you could then ride in the shells down the irrigation canals and ditches, float in the shells of watermelons. So he comes here, enticed by this myth. And at that very moment, the turbine pump is invented. And the farmer now doesn't have to depend on just the flow of the river. He could go to the aquifer, that huge lake beneath the ground, and draw from that groundwater. So we see then the footprint of agriculture go to ground that is even worse and worse and worse. And there's so much pumping going on that the groundwater table is dropping from 5 feet to 10 feet to 20 feet to 100 to 300 feet deep. And the ground itself, as the water is being drawn down, the ground itself is sinking in a phenomenon called subsidence. And at that moment that my grandfather is here, he is picking potatoes in Weed Patch, California. Drought hits. A raisin bust happens. There's so many raisins being grown, too many. The raisin busts. The drought hits. And the farmers say, we need more water. The pump isn't enough. The rivers aren't enough. The aquifer isn't enough. And this is when we decide to build the Central Valley Project. It's born out of the droughts, the historic droughts of the 1920s. And this is the project that takes the San Joaquin River from its watershed and moves it 150 miles south to Bakersfield. The San Joaquin River, which belongs to Fresno and Madera, its flow now goes to Kern. The Sacramento River then is brought down to replace the flow of the San Joaquin. So each place is stealing from the other place. And the people in Sacramento agree to this because their Sacramento River, which is 4 to 5 times more powerful than the San Joaquin and the Kern and the Kings, it's getting flooded out all the time. They're flooding out the city of Sacramento. So they agree to bring their water here. And this begins the Central Valley Project. And farming grows bigger. 30 years later, we end up adding more pieces to the Central Valley Project, and that is then not enough to cover the ambitions of farmers. And so we end up building a state water project. That aqueduct, our great concrete river that goes 444 miles and takes the water of the north and moves it to the west side of Kern and then onto the faucets and swimming pools of Los Angeles. So this is the level of extraction and engineering that took place. And this is, as we get through that history, then I return to the land. And I begin by going to Lost Hills and telling the story of Stuart and Linda Resnick, these billionaires from Beverly Hills who've come up and over the mountain and created a kind of company town out of Lost Hills and Avenal and McFarland. And they're growing, they're the biggest growers of pistachios and almonds and mandarins in the world, and the biggest growers of pomegranates, and they're making this juice called palm juice. And at the time I get there, about 25, 30 years after they've been farming, they are now deciding to give back to those communities in ways that no farmer, not even J.G. Boswell in the Tulare Lake Basin, had done. And so I am confronted with these company towns where the boss man, if you will, and the boss woman, the pomegranate princess and the nut king, they are starting to give back to these areas. They're building schools in Delano. They're funding health programs for their workers. And so I am trying to reconcile all these contradictions in the last third of this book as the footprint of agriculture gets to a point that is beyond sustainability. It's a challenging read. I will give you that. I hope that the family story, my involvement and engagement with the land will pull the reader through some of the more heavy plowing areas of that ground of that book. Anyhow, the fun of doing these things, not so fun over Zoom. Much prefer this to be in person. But the fun of it, of these back and forth, is always the questions and answers. So I would love to, open this up to some Q&A, if that would be nice. Andrew, do you think that's proper?
Yeah.
I think this is a great time for Q&A. So we can kind of do this in both ways. You can either post a question in the chat, or we've got our Q&A section here as well. Actually, here's one. Mark, I don't know if you can see in the Q&A box.
I don't, but go ahead.
You don't. So it's from Dennis. You spoke about how complex water is in California. Did Cadillac Desert by Mark Reisner play a role in your understanding of water and how the valleys changed? And then I guess I'll piggyback real quick. Are there other sort of models or writers that have talked about the West and water environment and such?
Well, we have Wallace Stegner, who is a giant, was a giant, who did a book on John Wesley Powell and the development of the West, and how we decided that even though it was arid here, we were going to create these kinds of civilizations, sprawling agriculture and cities and suburbia. That was a model. There was a historian named Donald Wooster who wrote a very beautiful book called Rivers of Empire. That was one. Reisner's book, obviously I read it. I was thankful that Mark Reisner spent most of his time on the larger West and just wrote a couple chapters on California. Had he taken California and written it the way he wrote that entire book, I probably would have never done the Dreamt Land. I would have figured it was done. Reisner, his book is different. His book, there's no I in there. He doesn't really appear in there. He is not a Californian. He comes from the East. He lives here for a number of years. What he did is he recreated scenes as they were happening in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and did a telling that way. That's a very difficult kind of storytelling to do in a literary way, and he managed to do that. It's a giant of an accomplishment. And mine was different. I had our story, family story to tell. I had my previous books about California that had informed me. So, different ways of at it. And in this book, when I retell the story of Los Angeles stealing the first river, the river in Owens Valley, bringing it 230 miles over the mountain into the San Fernando Valley so LA could keep growing and growing all the way to the desert and beyond. Reisner had written that first, and I give him a big nod in this book. So I get to steal a little bit from him.
Okay, good. Now we're filling up in the Q&A. That's excellent to hear. Let's see. Stuff's coming in all at once. 1 second here. Let's see. Elaborate on the Resnicks, the contradictions, those contradictions you mentioned. And let's see. Andrew also has another question that sort of piggybacks on that. In terms of, how did you get the Resnicks to open up? These types of things. So maybe.
Okay, so these big farmers never want to tell their story. They're quite happy to die with the history on the pillow. When I went to the Tulare Lake Basin, the Boswell family, they were the biggest farmers, single farmers in America, if not the world. Their family motto was, as long as the whale never surfaces, it is never harpooned. So In the Tulare Lake Basin, there was the culture was a culture of utter secrecy, and I could say that for much of agriculture. And if you look at McWilliams and all this storytelling that goes on prior to my storytelling, it's almost always from the vantage of the people, but not the farmer. How to get the farmer to tell his story, to open up. And I think it helped that I came from a farming family. I think it helped that I was Armenian, because so many farmers were Armenian. I think it helped that as a journalist for the LA Times in my early years, I tried to write about agriculture in a way that was fair. So Boswell ended up opening up in a way that stunned myself and Rick Wartzman. I mean, we had access to everything in their archives. Resnick had read The King of California and liked that book. And he called me to his headquarters on the west side of Los Angeles and wondered in early 2000s, 2003, 2004, if I might be interested in writing a book about him. And I had just finished The King of California, and my publisher and editor both said, well, what's this book going to be? The new King of California? The second King of California? So I decided to pass. But I kept watching Resnick as he grew bigger and bigger, and he combined the culture of the valley with the culture, the kind of agriculture of the valley, with the sales kind of culture and marketing of LA. And this was something new, because most farmers, they would do their crops, they'd go off, maybe some of them boxed their own crops and did some marketing, but not to the degree that the Resnicks were doing, buying Super Bowl ads to sell their pistachios and palm juice, going to the Oscars and handing out these gift baskets to the stars that had their almonds and pistachios and palm juice in it. So I kept watching and watching and watching, and I decided that the Dreamt Land was a perfect place, because his were the orchards. He and his wife Linda, they were consuming more Californian water than any single couple in the state for their orchards. And I thought this is a time to go in and try to tell their story and how they were taking off these record crops, growing their footprint even in the midst of drought. And I went there fully thinking that this was going to be, a profile of greed, of hubris, of extraction that was on a level that few in agriculture had practiced. And it was that. But it was also something more. As I met them in person and saw what they were doing, those encounters complicated the portrait. And when you're writing about something you think is kind of evil, you don't want to get complicated, but you have an obligation to get complicated. You have an obligation to mess with your theory of someone. And they messed with it. And so some people read that chapter and say, you kind of eased up at the end on the Resnicks. But no, actually in the epilogue you come back and you don't ease up on them. And why? And you didn't challenge them enough. And others saying, boy, you were harsh on them. And some people, the Resnicks are Jewish, and some Jewish readers said, man, that came kind of close to, there's a little bit of stuff in there that almost sounded almost anti-Semitic. And I said, no. So I pushed back on all of that, but the portrait was complicated. And I asked him, I said, do you have any guilt? And he said, well, I'm Jewish. Of course I have guilt. There's Jewish guilt. And then I thought, well, wait a second. Without guilt, we wouldn't have any libraries or museums in America. It was the wealthy guilt that ended up building all that. So this is the complex portrait that comes out of that. And I think that's the reason I put myself into these books, is I want the reader to see that my own viewpoint, I come in one way and maybe I come out a little more nuanced. Maybe I'm more angry as I come out, or maybe I'm more philosophical. But I let the reader see that, and hopefully it's a honest way of engaging.
That's a great answer. There's a question from Manpreet Kaur. What non-ag stories of the Valley need to be told? What communities or regions do you feel might create the next Soroyan or Arax? So I guess this question's kind of about, different communities
Okay.
in the Valley outside of industry and stuff. Yeah.
You know, it's funny. I think every story I tell in the Valley, the land is a character. So when I was going inside the prison industrial complex that California had built, which is the largest prison industrial experiment ever done in the history of man, most of it playing out in the middle of California. Well, there were African American inmates in Corcoran State Prison from Los Angeles, from the Valley, looking out to these cotton fields. Those cotton fields, in some cases, were the very cotton fields that had brought their families west. So it's wherever you poking at the narrative of California, the land becomes part of that story. So when you're in the Valley, I don't know. I mean, we could talk about the poverty of Fresno, a city that has been hollowed out at the core. There's a huge crater in the center of Fresno. And it's been caused by a couple factors. One is racism, redlining. My own family, the Armenians, could not live in a certain part of town in Fresno, the fancier parts of town, all the way through the 60s. Mid-60s, early 60s. There were restrictive real estate covenants that said no Negro, Mexican, Japanese, Chinese can live here. And that's why when I grew up, our next door neighbor was Dr. Fitzalbert Marius. He was an African American doctor. We lived right next door to each other. I became great friends with his daughter. That was on Tulare Avenue in Fresno, in the south end of town. My dad was a fabulous athlete, a football player who went off to USC, didn't graduate, came back to the family farm. He was a great golfer. He couldn't play golf at Sunnyside Country Club. Armenians weren't allowed to be members there. One day, I'll tell this little story. It's kind of funny. The golf pro at Sunnyside walks into his bar in the afternoon. My dad recognizes him right off. The man orders a drink. My dad pours the drink. The man grabs the drink. He puts it to his lips, and my dad then takes the drink out of his hand from his lips and says, you know, I can't play golf at your country club, and you can't drink at my bar. So the next great stories, I think, are going to bubble up from the same places. You know, I'm tracing, as I go backward, I'm coming across the path of Steinbeck, Soroyan, Didion, Haslam. And 20 years from now, some young buck, woman, man, young, you know, probably a Latina, maybe a Hmong, they're going to come across my path. And they're either going to say, that white dude, yeah, he didn't get it right. Or they're going to say, you know, that white dude did all right. I'm going to build on his stuff. What I think freed me up was the idea that because of the way I grew up, because my dad had this nightclub where he was mixing Chicanos and blacks and Hell's Angels together. And let me tell you, it was a volatile, sometimes violent mix. And he was bringing in all this live music. I mean, Chuck Berry played at my dad's bar in the summer of 1971. But because of that, I felt that as a writer, I could go anywhere. I could cross any cultural, racial boundary. And it was my job to get that story right. Tougher to get it right when you were dealing with a culture that wasn't yours. But you had an obligation to go deeper and deeper and try to get it right. And if you didn't get it right the first time, to go back and try to get closer to it. But I would not like to see any storyteller be told that they couldn't tell a story because they might be appropriating another's culture. A storyteller can go anywhere. They just got to get it right.
They're great answers. There are two questions that are sort of related about water. Oliver asks about the future of water, specifically the role of investors buying and selling water. What your thoughts are, and then sort of piggybacking on that, Pete asks about if there were a single best regulatory change.
These are good. These are
water.
Related. Yes.
For the interest of all, what would some of those things be?
So it took California, this great progressive state, it took us 150 years to regulate the extraction of groundwater. We had to wait until that extraction was sinking our canals, our roads, and the aqueduct, sinking it so that the water could no longer flow. We had to wait until that before we decided we're going to regulate groundwater. And we were a little gutless about it. We said, we're going to regulate it, but we're going to take 20 years to figure out that precise regulation. That is called SGMA. And right now, that is the great force on the land. We're going to see whether the state of California will be capable of putting these restrictions in place. Right now, the farmers in these areas of overdraft of the aquifer have come up with these plans to become more sustainable. In other words, to not extract more groundwater than the rivers in the heavy snowmelt years recharge. So what you're taking out, the rivers are putting back in heavy snowmelt years. It's a zero game. That's what you want. Right now, we're way, way in the deficit. Will the state have the guts to enforce this? If they do, we're going to see, of the 6 million acres of farmland we have in the San Joaquin Valley, we're going to see at least 1 million acres go fallow. In Kern County alone, the big farmers have admitted to me that of the 900,000 acres that are farmed in Kern County, probably 300,000 acres will have to go idle if we're truly trying to reach sustainability. And yet, you know what's going on right now? Big investment companies, hedge funds, pension funds, the Canadian Royal Mounties, their fund, their retirement fund from Canada, are coming up and buying up these valley farmlands. And they're digging more wells, and they're expanding the footprint even more, right as we're on the cusp of having to move the other way. This is the madness that goes on. I talk about it, write about it in the Dreamt Land. You would have thought it would have, slowed down or something. It's not. We've always had outside investors in the valley, but it's getting to the point now where these outside investors are coming in, and even as the price of almonds has dropped from $5 to $2, they are making a gamble on this land and the water. And they're thinking in 5 to 10 year increments. We'll squeeze out 10 years of profits, and then we'll get out and we'll invest in some other fund. So these are two destructive forces that have been unleashed on the ground here, and it makes me very concerned. Listen, agriculture has tremendous ills to it. Pesticides, the exploitation of labor, all these things. There's a way to make ag more sustainable, more humane. I'd like to see that kind of agriculture, and it exists in certain parts of the valley. I'd like to see that kind of agriculture as opposed to paving it over with houses, suburbs, mini malls, and turning into another San Fernando Valley. That's my worry right now. There's a more humane way, a more sustainable way to do agriculture here. And where you see it, interestingly enough, is in the middle of the valley, in places like Kingsburg, Selma, Fowler. These are places where the groundwater is relatively high, where the rivers flow through there, and it doesn't take extreme pumping from 2,000 feet deep to grow agriculture. It's a more sane kind of agriculture. And what we see there are still the hold of smaller farms. Where you go out, like in Western Kern, Western Fresno, where there's no groundwater, where you're depending on these state and federal projects, where you're depending on water banking and buying and selling of water in a water market, that is less sustainable agriculture.
Thanks for that. Let's see, we've got some more questions here. This sort of connects to something you just talked about, just about this sort of exploitation of labor in the agricultural, in these many industries. And I actually might have heard you tell this story, and this might be in your book, or I might have just listened to you talk about this idea of exploitation in the in agriculture with laborers. And maybe you could, I mean, so that's sort of the question, right? Like the answer about how farmers can exploit labor from undocumented workers while not supporting citizenship, right? So that's sort of a double standard. And I remember you talking about something like this in your book. Maybe you can riff on this.
Okay. So over a century, we've reached deeper and deeper into the rural heart of Mexico to bring a labor force here. It's a very complicated story, okay? We've taken people from rural Mexico, impoverished Mexico, places where, you know, there may be 4th, 5th grade education. We brought them here. We would send them back during the Bracero program. In the last 40, 50 years, some have moved here, many have moved here. Some have moved up the economic ladder and they're out of agriculture. But we still have this ethic of exploitation. Now it's changing now with the mechanization. As our crops are moving from row crops, annual crops, to more permanent crops like nuts, we're seeing that those are mechanized crops, the machine, we don't need as much labor. And this is the great change that's happening, another transformation. So where the hand labor is still important and needed, you still see those old forces at work. The anecdote you're talking about, after Proposition 187 was voted on and passed, I believe it was 187, which basically said that, okay, we're going to have undocumented workers here in California, but, you know, we're not going to, if we find out that they're undocumented, they're not going to go to our schools, they're not going to get medical care. We're going to just basically treat them as third-class citizens and hope they go back across the line. This thing passed under Governor Pete Wilson. So I went to one of these small rural towns, to a coffee shop where all the farmers were gathered, and I was listening to them, and they were talking about how they had all voted for this law. And I thought, wait a second, this makes no sense. Your livelihood depends on these farm workers. And you voted for 187? And I started asking around. A gentleman rose up, a Lebanese American, a farmer who knew my family, and he said, hey man, come on over, I got to explain something to you. What sounds like a contradiction really isn't a contradiction. And I said, what do you mean? He said, we're engaged in a century-long game with the Mexican picker. It's a game of power. If they realize their power, their collective power, they could bring us to our knees. So that's one reality. The other reality is that 187, 198, 213, whatever law you want to call it, none of those laws are going to stop the migration of Mexicans to California. They're always going to be a labor force for us. So we voted for this 187 because we wanted to tell the Mexican who comes here, we wanted to tell them that their position is always a little iffy. They wanted him to feel that insecurity. And that law made them feel insecure. That law was later found unconstitutional. But that was a lesson in real politics, that Lebanese grower, who happened to be the biggest tree fruit grower, maybe in the world, single biggest, he gave me a lesson, a little bit of schooling in a coffee shop not far from Highway 99.
Fascinating. We have a few questions, folks with their hands raised. Maybe Ara, you can unmute.
Ara, one of my fellow tribesmen, right on. That was my father's name, Ara.
Ara, you should be able to unmute your mic and talk. I think you've got that permission.
Hello?
Go for it.
I didn't ask a question, actually, but hello, Mark. It's Ara Magadicha.
Ara, inch peses.
How are you, brother?
It's good, man.
Great work. You brought up a lot of stuff that reminded me of some stuff I had written. I'm going to send it to you.
Beautiful.
I hope you and the family are well.
We are.
Good.
Same to you. My email hasn't changed. Just email me.
I got it.
Okay.
Good work. Beautiful presentation today.
Thank you.
Let me hop over to Manpreet. Manpreet has a question. Manpreet, you should be able to unmute your mic and ask a question.
Hello?
Yep,
Yes.
Go for it.
Okay. Well, first, barabda Uncle Arax in the I'll keep the Armenian theme slightly going, although with a Punjabi twist.
Right on. Yes.
Lavek?
Yeah.
So my question for you, Mark, is actually slightly in a different vein, and going to be a bit unfair because for a person who has obviously focused so much on my hometown of Fresno and the Valley in particular. But I almost wonder, just to hear some of your thoughts in some ways in terms of the Californication of the world in terms of agriculture, where when I look in terms of when we think of the Green Revolution, oftentimes associated with Norman Borlaug's name, but in so many ways it's many of the procedures that we saw here in California in terms of land use, water use, and to use your word of extraction, that we see really kind of creating, huge changes, whether that be in India, whether that be in the Philippines today, or even in parts of Mexico. So I wonder, just to, and for a person who's engrossed in history in the way that you are, it's a bit unfair to ask kind of questions of the future. But I wanted to ask you, like even beginning to look, away from California, what are some of your thoughts? Because you're seeing throughout the world this sort of California type of agriculture, exploitation, extraction. It's not sustainable everywhere. What sort of do you kind of see us moving in?
It's a great question. I mean, so much of my looking at things is what we import here. We import labor, we import the water to various places, we import billions of bees to hibernate. I mean, to pollinate our trees. We import pesticides. I mean, but there's something that we're exporting too. We're exporting this whole way. Now there's some shared things too. I mean, I think we got drip irrigation probably from Israel. And drip irrigation makes sense individually. It's like, okay, we're gonna make our more efficient our irrigation. But what happens is in the aggregate, drip irrigation ends up using up more water. you're putting more water on the ground because the drip line, unlike the furrow, can go uphill. It could go into hillsides. The drip line could go into poor ground. You know, you could have the worst ground that nothing should be planted in, but because you have that drip line, you could put a precise dose of water and chemicals into the root zone and grow that tree almost as if it was hydroponic. You know, the soil is just there, the dirt, we'll call it. It's not, I don't even know if it qualifies as soil. The dirt is there to just hold up the tree. So that kind of agriculture, yes, we have been tremendously innovative. And the UCs bring in all these folks from afar to come and see what we've done here. And then that stuff gets transported to other places. And, you know, maybe their water situations are different, maybe they're not. So, yeah, I think we're confronted right now with, you know, the other thing is Sigma and other things that we're doing good could also get exported. But we have to decide that, you know, whose land is going to get idled, and how do we make, if not whole, at least half the farmers who are going to be idling their ground because they made a poor decision. They actually grew crops in areas where there's no river, groundwater is poor, and the ground itself is not fertile. So I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah, I buy your premise that what we've created here for good and bad gets exported to other places. And it takes something that's problematic on a local level, a regional level, and makes it globally problematic.
We've got a interesting question here, sort of along. I think a lot of people look to historians as people who can maybe see into a crystal ball or something. So here's another question that deals with maybe possible predictions or thoughts on how things will change. There's a question: do you think valley politics will change as a result of demographic change, or will horticultural ideology and Oakeyism a dominant force for the near future?
It's a beautiful question, something I've written about controversially. I've written about this. So here was my great hope. My great hope was okay, even though the valley is so incredibly diverse. I mean, you know, we had the first Sikhs came here to pick in the 1890s. I mean, in Yuba City, I mean, the history of the Sikhs goes back, you know, more than a century here. The Japanese, the Chinese, I mean, you know, this is New York, but played out on soil. So you see this, but in spite of all that, when I grew up, the dominant culture was the redneck culture here. And they brought a lot of wonderful things from where they came from, but they also brought their racial baggage. I mean, I write about, you know, the first settlers that came to California. The ones who went to LA and San Francisco came from New York, Ohio, places like that. We got a lot of the old Confederates. We were so, our Southern sympathies during the Civil War were such that in the Valley, they had to build these, they weren't quite forts, but they were camps where to tamp down the Southern sympathizing, we had to bring in Union soldiers. So this is how we were made, and they still have a tremendous influence. If you go to these, the Board of Supervisors in particular, and these are guys who are on our air boards and everything else, making decisions about, you know, how do we clean up the worst air in the country? And their idea is, well, you don't make it hard on agriculture or oil, and not the warehouses either. You know, we're not going to do anything to clean up this air. But you're seeing that go from Dust Bowlers to now Azorean Portuguese. You know, Devin Nunes, okay. There's a guy named Buddy Mendez on Fresno County. You're seeing that conservative thing playing out in the ethnic groups. We're seeing Armenian conservatives getting on some of those boards. Now what we're seeing, and this was my disappointment, we're seeing Latinos, second and third generation Mexican Americans, Chicanos, getting on these on the school boards, on the city councils, and you're thinking, wow, they're going to make this right. and they aren't making it right. They are in the pockets of developers and farmers, and big oil, every bit as much as the white dude was. So I don't know when that politics is going to change. I'd love to have some more questions on that. I'd love to hear some feedback on that.
Yeah, it's a deep question.
It's deep and it's controversial, but if we don't talk about it, we have to talk about it. You know, they cratered out Fresno. They kept sprawling it to Clovis and then to Madera, and those were white guys benefiting white guys at first. Okay, now it's Latino politicians benefiting mostly white developers, and it's really upsetting to see. And maybe I shouldn't have expected anything different. That's just human. It's the human notion of politicians and developers in bed together.
Actually, I had a quick question, Mark, to kind of piggyback off of that. Do you see parallels there between, say, the development of Los Angeles with white flight and the freeway development? Like, are there parallels with that, with like the hollowing out of, you know, Fresno, and like the hollowing out effectively of, like, say, Bunker Hill back in the early 20th century, like mid 20th century?
Absolutely. We've got a Measure C right now in Fresno County. It's supposed to be our big funding. It's a tax on local people, and it's to fund highways and things like that. It's to fund roads, the building of roads and transportation system. This money, a disproportionate number of it in each of these, you know, each time the Measure C is renewed, is going not to improve, well, some of it's going to improve the core, but not enough, not nearly enough. Too much of it is going to make new highways up to places like Shaver Lake and Huntington Lake and these places in the mountains, these places where white people can escape to. And the county is allowing them to build in the path of wildfire. Okay. When I went up to Paradise and saw 4 months after that fire what had been built on a geological chimney right in the path of wildfire, 40,000 people planted there. And that place was wiped off the map, but it could have been predicted that it would have been wiped off the map. We barely escaped in this creek fire from seeing Shaver Lake go up in flames. And yet they're doing another round of Measure C funding, and they want to use it to build new freeways, highways, to sprawl out even farther so they can hollow out and crater out Fresno even more, the core of it. I don't know, man.
Well, we're hitting the end of our time here.
Can we go another? We have like 11 questions. Can we just do some bang stuff real quick, or no?
Yes,
I'm willing to go through it. It's all right.
Good.
I mean, yeah.
I'm glad. Okay. There's Dennis talks about, he might have spoken to you some time ago and talks about a story of Delano and the untold story of Filipino farm workers and the UFW. Is that still on your radar?
Yeah, we talked about that in the earlier session, how it's tough to find any Filipino farmers around here. But that story, I think that history is starting to be told. The Filipinos were a little hesitant to tell it at first. I saw a rapprochement between the Mexicans and the Filipinos at a place about 10 years ago, and I'm hoping that builds, and so that collective story could be told, because the Filipinos were absolutely, well, an argument can be made that they were there before Cesar Chavez in organizing the farm workers.
Catherine asks about, speaking of the fate of the Paiute in the Owens Lake area as the water was extracted and how that way of life was destroyed.
So the native in the Owens Valley actually practiced an early agriculture. You know, most of the natives did not cultivate. Okay, they took from the land, but in Owens they had a whole culture there that actually were growing crops and taking the flow of the river and using it to grow crops. One of the handful of tribes that did that. Mary Austin, the great writer, the little The Little Land of Rain, I think it was. Or so I've got it here. It's one of the canonical books of California.
Yeah, my mom, my grandpa was the superintendent of Inyo County Schools, Mel Bernasconi.
Wow.
And my mom and her brother and sister grew up in Independence down the street from Mary Austin's house. Let's see, we've got a question about, sorry, I just lost. There was a question here earlier kind of about, here's two connected. One about complications with the Westlands Water District extraction. And then also talking about Fresno officials becoming cozy with developers. Talked about some of this, but anything else that might come to mind?
Okay, so Westlands was formed as a second part of the Central Valley Project in the 1950s. It got water in the 60s. It's the largest water district devoted to agriculture in the country. It was started as 600,000 acres. That was its original sin. It should have never been 600,000 acres because 300,000 acres of Westlands was prime, probably the most fertile soil that could be found in California, if not the West, if not America. It's this stuff called the Panoche loam, and it grows. I saw a radish. No, was it a radish? Yeah, grown that was the size of a head of a man. Okay, this is how big it was coming out of the Panoche loam. 300,000 acres of prime soil. The other 300,000 was problem ground. It had high salts, salinity, and it would perch. It did not drain well. So from the outset, it was too big. It should have been half the size. So what's happened today is because of drought, because of environmental restrictions of water coming from the Delta into Westlands through San Luis Reservoir, the farmers have actually reduced their footprint for all, in practicality, to about 300,000 acres. So they own all of the 500,000 that's left, or 600. 100 was retired earlier because of salts, but they're only farming 300,000. And I think the future of Westlands will be that they will, at some point, officially recognize that they will be a district of 275,000 acres of high-value crops. And that will be a more sustainable agriculture. It won't solve all the problems, because when we decided to farm the west side of the valley, Western Kern and Western Fresno, we took on problem ground that didn't have great, and it had no river, had an aquifer that was problematic. So the farming became problematic. It became more of an example of extraction. And as a result, the towns that are there on the west side are more farm labor towns. They're not like the east side or the middle, where the children of farm workers and the children of farmers go to school together. You know, these are very, very poor places, like Huron.
Here was a question from David Ian. Are you aware of George Tinkham, centering on Stockton? He says he marvels at the distance from the northern San Joaquin Valley histories by George Tinkham.
I don't know George Tinkham, man. I got to look him up. I probably have read some of his stuff, just don't. I'm not associating it with his name.
Mainly centered on Stockton, 100+ years ago.
Yeah. Okay.
Interesting. Question from Justin. Justin's wife. What relationship do you see between agricultural production and fog in the Central Valley? Prior to industrialization of agriculture in California, would fog have increased or decreased because of it?
When the rivers ran free, we would have, it was a tremendous marshland. And that marsh created fog. As we developed, put more concrete in the land, the fog started disappearing. There's an old story, legend, that the fog is a Yokut curse. That the Yokuts told the white man, okay, go ahead and drain our lake. Take that lake. But the vestige of that lake, the remnant of that lake, the fog, will curse you forever. I'd like to believe that that is actually true. yeah, the fog is going. And because the fog is going, we are not getting the kind of chilling hours that we normally get for our trees to produce. And so trees have been sent into this weird pattern of production and light and heavy years because the fog isn't present there to lock in some of the cold.
And here's a final question from Julie. It's so great that you write about the Central Valley. In your career, having worked for the LA Times, what brought you to focus on the Central Valley? Was it simply from your family beginnings? And maybe I'll piggyback on this to spark a little more conversation. What has it been like going from sort of the work of a strict reporter, let's say, where it's maybe less common practice to weave your own story into your pieces, to a full, kind of change where you're able to do some reporting and give us some history, but you're definitely weaving your own story into it.
I think the luxury of working at the LA Times in the heyday was that you could, even if you didn't use the word I, your stories could have a very strong voice. And I kind of roamed the middle of the state, finding stories that no one else was telling, getting the green light from my editors to spend a month, 2 months, 3 months, a year, 2 years on one story. That luxury is not there anymore. Maybe at the New York Times for just a few journalists. So I had that. I think it helped develop my writerly voice, that I could, even if I didn't use the word I had, you could see me in those pieces. Okay, I was on the land, I was with the people. And so it got easier when I then went into magazine writing and then book writing, where the I became a natural thing. Why the Valley first? I started with the question of who killed my father and why. That's where I started all this at the age of 15. So yes, I started with the family, and I just kept moving out and out and out. And I feel like to figure out California as a whole, I don't need to go anywhere else in the West. I'm just going to continue to try to, as long as I got, to try to chronicle California in different ways. I'm working on a novel now, but much of it is borrowed from all the people and stories that I've gathered as a nonfiction writer. I know the road of fiction writing is littered with nonfiction writers, but I'm gonna try it, because I want to do these books. It's taking so long. It's taking so much energy of reporting and everything being factually correct, and then finding out, oh, I made an error on page 340. I'm trying to free myself up a little bit from that, and maybe find this in-between genre that mixes fact and fiction, and that's where I'm headed.
So inspiring. This has just been an excellent night and an excellent event. We're so happy you could join us. Everyone in the chat is super excited about this evening, and I really feel like, yeah, your work in general is just helping us view the place we live with fresh eyes, and it inspires tremendously. So we thank you for that.
Thank you. And it was, we started with Jerry, and I think we ought to end with Jerry. It's he laid down he did his stuff here, and those stories will live on, and you just hope that the kids, as they're trying to answer their own questions, puzzle out their own mysteries, that they don't ignore the folks that wrote before, because there's just so much to learn from them, and I guess I say that as an act of self-preservation as well, But anyhow, pleasure, and can't wait to get down there in person and get on the road again.
Indeed. Yeah. Andrew, any other business you want to take care of?
I just wanted to thank Mark for being here, for the panel earlier, and also for this. So just a quick announcement regarding these sessions. They are being recorded, and they will be available for viewing on the Bakersfield College Social Justice Institute webpage, YouTube channel. And I just wanted to reiterate too, you know, with the loss of Gerald Haslam, we did lose a really significant storyteller from the Valley, and we were really fortunate to have him as our first speaker for this grant program back in 2017. And I was telling Mark earlier in a conversation after the panel that you know, it just feels really great that we were able to bookend the entire series for this grant with two great writers that focus on the region and who were telling stories of it. In the case of Jerry, telling a lot of his personal stories through combinations of autobiographical nonfiction and also fiction. And here we have Mark telling stories through a combination of memoir and sort of investigative journalism, sort of merging and meshing together. But both obviously operating in very important ways to make sure that stories of this area get told and have some posterity right beyond the writer's life in the written word. So so it's been a really great program. I'm thankful for Mark for being here, and looking forward to chatting again in the future about getting you here once we're able to have events on campus.
That'd be sweet. Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for Bakersfield College, everybody. Appreciate it so much. Thanks for the audience for joining in.
Yeah, and thanks for the National Endowment for the Humanities for sponsoring this programming.
Oh yeah, you better believe it.
Giving us that grant in the first place.